Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about a very important part of the physical economy, and that's energy. You really can't get along without it, whether you're powering your computer, driving down the road, flipping on the lights in your room, or flying across the country. You've got to have energy. The nature of energy, the structure of energy production and delivery in this country has really changed in recent years. Fortunately for us, the U.S. Energy Information Agency has just published a short-term outlook and assessment of the U.S. energy situation. It was released in mid-August of 2021. So I have obtained that assessment, and I've extracted from it a number of very informative graphs, and I'm going to show them to you now. For your information, the EIA a few months ago, back in February, also published in compliance with federal law, a long-term outlook for energy in the world. And I'm going to post, again, my extracts from that very long publication on your Moodle shell. I doubt that we'll have a chance to go over it in a Zoom publication because it is so long and the graphs in it are so complicated. But I do recommend strongly that you look at the long-term outlook as well as EIA's short-term outlook. So with that, let me see if I can bring up the PowerPoint, which of course for me is always somewhat of a challenge. Hold on and let me see if I can get it here. And there we go. All right. Now, there are a lot of slides in this one as well, just not as many as a long-term outlook. So I'm not going to linger too long on any slide so that we can get right through this. But you should take the time to look at these slides on your own and get all the meaning from them that you can, because there's a lot of very valuable meaning here. Okay, so let's see if we can start. Hello, there we go. So this is the trend in the crude oil prices. One of the more frequently used measures of crude oil prices, West Texas Intermediate. And you can see here that where the pandemic began, the prices really dropped because the demand for energy also dropped. We just didn't drive our cars as much to go to work or do a great number of things that we used to do. And you can see that according to EIA, it's going to be a while here this year before West Texas prices catch up with last year and then keep on going on. Now, you and I both know that our gasoline prices have been rising. And here I think we can see a major reason. There's been a big demand for petroleum recently. And when demand challenges supply, prices go up. Here's the spot price for natural gas, which you will find is extremely important in our economy, and we'll be talking about the reasons for that. But once again, you can see not the same big drop that we had in crude oil, but a drop nevertheless. And again, a spike to meet demand as the economy picked up. And then when it did, came back to something like a trend. And according to the EIA, natural gas prices are going to be kept under pretty good control for the next couple of years. Now, something that I didn't point out in the last slide, but will be in this one and a great many more, and that is the confidence bands in surrounding EIA's forecast. And in the report, EIA goes to some length to explain. Pardon me, I need to keep my throat moist. But EIA explains that because of the pandemic and all of the industrial turbulence that has happened since then, as well as political turbulence, EIA is unable to put together highly real or a very tight forecast without large acknowledgement of potential variability around their forecast. So you can see the upper bound gets really high and the lower bound gets really low, which makes you wonder just what the use of these forecasts is. And the answer is that we need to use energy forecasts to do strategic planning. And the EIA has a lot of expertise. They also make a lot of mistakes, as economists do. But this is the EIA's forecast, the blue line going forward. So here we have liquid fuel production and consumption. And you can see that what happened was that consumption dropped very fast when the pandemic hit. We just didn't predict it. We weren't ready for it. And of course, look at the drop in consumption of liquid fuels, which is oil and gas. So production took a while to adapt and slow down. And as the recovery occurred, production has had to wait until inventories were used. And so you can see that it'll be sometime next year before we regain the 2019 level. Folks, that's an awfully long time for an industry to be on hold and to be operating at less than full capacity. But there it is. So the liquid fuels consumption, the term liquid fuels, it means oil, but it also means liquefied natural gas and other liquid petroleum-based products. And you can again see the decline followed by the gradual recovery, reaching 2019's level in 2022. How did this change occur? And we can see that the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which was formed in response to OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, Organization for Production and Exporting countries, I guess. We'll see that. The good news is we're going to see that translated for us in a few slides, since my memory doesn't work very well. And when the recession and the pandemic occurred, these nations that had formed in response to OPEC really dropped the consumption. Other countries, which by and large are less developed. OPEC is made up, OECD is made up of some highly developed countries. So when they reduced their consumption, it had a major effect. Now we see that this year, those countries are coming back to consume petroleum and liquid fuels, but so are the other countries in the world, and the OECD isn't making such a the dominant influence that it had previously. So we see 8.5 billion barrels per day out of a total of about 100 billion in normal times. So taking it, that's about 8.5% reduction. And then we're going to see this year about 5.25% recovery, which isn't a full recovery. All right, so here's production of crude oil. This is the stuff they drill out of the ground or the ocean. And you can see again, there was a pretty good drop and then recovery. What is it that, where did this change occur? And by and large, it was here in the 48 states. And that was true also when the pandemic hit and consumption was reduced. So not all. In the old days, we produced most of our crude oil in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as other ocean locations. But since fracking arose and we discovered shallow and tight deposits of oil and natural gas right here in the continental United States, that is where more production has occurred. All right, so here we have crude oil and liquid fuels production worldwide. And you can see a much more dramatic drop when the pandemic occurred. And it was followed by another this year. And so it's going to be a while before we see a recovery. And in fact, EIA suggests that that's going to happen sometime in 2022. Pardon me, let me get a drink again. I have a hoarse throat because I've been doing a lot of videos. Sorry about that. Okay. So once again, the components have changed. We see the OPEC countries having already dropped a lot of production during the year prior to the pandemic, while non-OPEC countries, particularly North America, meaning the United States and Canada, but it was still, we were still producing, and yet when the pandemic occurred, oh boy, everything dropped like a stone, including operations in Eurasia, in the northeast portion of Europe. Kazakhstan is an example. In any event, the forecast now sees worldwide about 2.2 million barrels improvement this year on a net basis, and 5.5 million barrels improved next year. So if this is about 6.6 million barrels, it looks like by the end of next year, we'll have done 7.6. So we'll have caught up. All right, so liquid fuels production. And again, we're talking largely crude oil, but we have to include some liquefied natural gas. And in any event, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, doggone it, has been a steady producer, but it's been coming down lately, especially during when the pandemic arose. And you can see that EIA, it does not expect a real rapid recovery, even by 2022. It'll reach the prior level perhaps in 2022. You can see that in the earlier years here in 2019, the level, OPEC's level was actually a little bit higher than it is expected to be in 2022. Now, here's non-OPEC, which includes those countries in OECD and others, such as Russia. Russia, I'm sure you know, is a major producer, but look at what happened when the pandemic hit. We went from, as I mentioned, it was about 8.5%, and this looks like it's just about 8.5 million barrels out of 100. I always think in terms of 100 million barrels because that just seems to be the level that was normal for a long time. You can see that EIA expects that perhaps by the end of next year, we'll surpass that level. We'll see. But EIA does expect that production will increase and increase faster than OPEC. The consumption levels for OECD, for that group of industrialized nations that our country is a member of, you can see the decline and then sort of a recovery. But notice that the recovery doesn't quite get back to where we were before that well-known commodity hit the fan. It's going to take a while. And EIA has made it very clear that it does not expect a recovery much before 2023. For other countries, you can see there are more of them, and they suffered a bigger dip in consumption, and it's going to take them even longer to realize a full recovery. Here's what I think is a funny chart. Again, I'm going to get a drink. For OPEC, that group of industrialized nations that we're a member of, This is a graph of surplus oil production capacity. So you can see that we had 3 million barrels of surplus capacity. It drops to 2 and so forth. 2 again in 2017. And then the surplus capacity when the pandemic arises goes up to over 6 million barrels. Now, what's funny about this chart is that EIA calculates the 2011 to 2020 average as 2.5 million barrels per day. But that's because 2020 is included. If they had calculated the average from 2011 to 2019 before the pandemic occurred, then this black line would have come down quite a bit. I really don't know what impression they were trying to convey by that, but it's clearly, it's almost misleading, but I wanted to at least make you aware of it. Okay, so here's a crude oil and liquid fuels imports, and there's an interesting sort of message here, and it's also a bit of a quandary, but you can see since 2015, our imports had been declining. Why is that? Because we were producing so much oil and natural gas from domestic locations using fracking. I don't know if you've heard the term fracking. If not, look it up. It's the device, it's the method of drilling a short distance in the earth rather than drilling deep down as in old methods. But there are deposits of oil and natural gas that are fairly close to the surface. They are not as large as the deep deposits, but they're easy to get to and therefore less costly to develop. And this country really developed those. As a result, we didn't have to import as much. And as you can see, it eventually came to pass that we were a net exporter, and that was good for our country, both economically and in terms of security. Now, what's been happening lately? I guess we have to be careful in how we interpret the word lately. But one possibility is to think in terms of change of the government administration. The current government, as you know, is not favorable toward production of oil and gas, and do not favor developing new pipelines, for instance. As a matter of fact, if you recall in the news, there was a famous case about a pipeline that was canceled, even though it was almost finished. So the result has been more imports. The good news is that the net imports, well, I don't know, I guess it's not good news, but more recently, the petroleum products, and by the way, the products are explained for you down here. So these are imports of gasoline, distillates, hydrocarbon gas liquids, jet fuel. Don't need a lot of that with airlines in the shape they're in, and so forth. So the imports of those products have declined, and they have declined because of the economy's turn down. We know that eventually they'll come back up again. So we have something going on where crude oil imports, which we used to export, we used to produce more than we needed. And petroleum products and liquids, those imports have declined, but and by quite a bit, some 4 billion barrels, 4 million barrels per day. But this decline isn't going to be, isn't going to last very long. So what we've got is a trend of net imports that will keep on rising. Is this something that is good for the US economy? And among other things, for the prices that you will pay for gasoline and electric energy. We'll leave that for another discussion, but this is a pretty significant exhibit here. Okay, so here we have natural gas production, and you can see that it's been on a pretty steady increase. The US has been a prolific producer of natural gas, and the chart on the right breaks down the categories of natural gas. By the way, note that even when the recession occurred, and in this year, we did not curtail production of natural gas. We needed less because less products made from liquid natural gas liquids are demanded right now. But you can see in the next year, 2022, it's expected that things are going to pick up, and the demand for ethane in particular will really skyrocket. So if you have a chance to buy stock in a company that produces ethane, there's your opportunity. Here is the net trade of hydrocarbon gas liquids. And these are the same gas liquid products that we saw on the prior chart. But notice that the exports, net exports, have increased pretty steadily. And again, this is because the US has been such a prolific producer of natural gas and natural gas liquids. This is a good thing. The US needs a more favorable trade balance. It presently has an unfavorable trade balance. That is to say, it imports more than it exports, but not in the case of natural gas liquid products. In that case, it has a favorable trade balance because it exports more than it imports. Here's natural gas consumption. Not a whole lot to talk about here, except that we can see that when natural gas consumption dropped, it dropped, among other things, due to residential and commercial demand, which means the demand for heating and basic power requirements. But you can see that the natural gas was still being used last year to produce electric power. This year, there's been a demand reduction in demand for natural gas to produce electric power, but an increase in that same stuff that we saw decreasing last year for residential and commercial use. And again, heating comes immediately to my mind. I'm sure there are other reasons. Okay. Uh, Here we have imports and exports of natural gas. And again, you can simply see the exports outweigh the imports. You can see that the imports are probably coming to us by liquefied natural gas, as liquefied natural gas, and by pipeline from Canada, and less from Mexico. On the other hand, our exports by pipeline are really dominant. You can see they've been growing. On the other hand, the liquefied natural gas exports also have increased drastically. So the net of imports less exports is about 12.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. By the way, I tried it. You can too. But I took a look at the graph. I said, okay, let's see if they're telling the truth. This is about 7.5. This is about 10. I'm sorry, I'm going to call that 8. So up 8, down 10. My golly, we had net exports of 2, and the numbers are quite accurate here. Okay, coal consumption, as I'm sure you're aware, is not the most popular product that we try to consume, but we have to. Coal is used in a great many electric power plants, both in this country to a declining extent, and in other countries, and more so in some other countries such as India and China. So there's, and to the extent that there's demand for our coal in other countries such as India, even though we don't want to consume it here, there is demand for that product in other countries. But our consumption, as you would expect, dropped drastically. And this is probably an indicator of electricity power generation and then the recovery back to more normal levels and patterns. And you can see that most of these changes are due to electric power demand. Now, rather interesting little item here is that there's an expectation of a reduction in electric power demand for coal in 2022, which means that the EIA expects coal production and coal-fired electric power plants to be retired in 2022, and frankly, in the following years. So as electric power plants that burn coal are retired and replaced by power plants that use natural gas or perhaps other types of renewable fuels, then the production of coal also is going to decline. Okay, so here we have just U.S. electricity consumption. I should have probably put that one before the one that broke things down. Sorry about that. But you can see that electricity consumption exhibits a fairly regular pattern. In 2020, we saw the reduction, as we've mentioned many times already here. And the components of change differed, have differed somewhat. We can see that industrial consumption of electricity and commercial and transportation, we use electricity in a lot of transportation systems, as I'm sure you know, public transportation. But here, when we look at industrial and commercial and transportation, that's pretty much where the action is. And we can see that action reverses this year with an increase in industrial sales of electricity and a little bit of an increase in commercial and transportation, and then not much change in 2022. Here's an interesting chart. Let me get another drink. This chart is primarily historic, but it does include last year and this year. But if you just look at the chart historically, you can see that natural gas has been increasing as a source of electric power. So utilities are using natural gas more and more. Now, you can see that the total of electricity generation dropped in 2020, and we know why. But we see this year, as it comes back up, so does natural gas. And natural gas just seems to have a lot of staying power in the electric power generation industry. On the other hand, you can see what has happened to coal as a source of electric power. Now, it looks like the EIA is expecting an increase this year and then a slight decline next year. Nuclear power has stayed about the same, although EIA has written that it expects nuclear power to come offline over the long term. For my own purposes, early in my career, I worked with a firm that audited and consulted for electric utilities that used nuclear power. And although we did have a couple of accidents in that industry way back when, the technology is far improved and is very cost efficient. So, but the reason for nuclear not being used as much in the future or today is largely political. Too bad for you and me, because it would have saved a lot of price. But there's always that risk. So the renewables, non-hydro and hydropower, of course, is the power that comes from dams that are built on rivers, and when they can generate quite a lot of electricity at a low cost. However, I don't know if you're keeping in touch with what's going on out west, but right now the Hoover Dam, for instance, and the big dams out west are almost unable to supply power because the lakes that they are built on have become very low. And that's because of the drought conditions in the far west regions of the United States, where those rivers and dams are located. But the non-hydro, you're familiar with that. And of course, you can see this green line rising as a percent of power generated in the United States. And it's up to about 15% now. So that's quite a growth when you consider that back in 2011, it was less than 5%. So it's a threefold increase. Um, you can also see what the proportionate importance of coal has been, not very much. Nuclear stays pretty much the same, drops a little bit, and then there's natural gas. Comes down a little bit because we have a little increase in looks like some coal-fired plant has been completed, something like that. But the trend for natural gas is probably going to be up a little more and flatten out. The real question is, how far can this green line go? So renewable energy, that was the green line. And so the supply in the United States, what about that? And we've got to look over to the right side for the legend. But here, the yellow is solar. The dark blue is wind. And you can see that EIA expects a lot more wind power to come online in the next couple of years. And because wind power requires construction of towers and so forth, we can pretty well bet that those contracts are already in place and that this forecast is pretty reliable. We can see hydropower holding its own, but coming down a bit, largely for the reasons that I explained, the drought, and of course, the drought. And liquid biofuels, frankly, I never know how to deal with liquid biofuels. I know they're good, but it seems to me that it must be very difficult to produce them in great quantity. And then the biomass down here, the brown. Okay. Here we go. Liquid biofuels include all these things such as ethanol, biodiesel, and so forth. Other biomass includes municipal waste and so forth. So every once in a while, I'll take a look down at the bottom of the chart. Another question that comes up often is energy sustainability and environmental sustainability, rather. And the carbon dioxide emission, of course, is a very frequently discussed topic. It certainly isn't the only one. For instance, we're concerned by lots of greenhouse gases besides carbon dioxide. But you can see that the largest source is petroleum production. The second is natural gas. Remember that natural gas production and consumption are growing rapidly, and yet the amount of carbon dioxide emissions stays pretty flat. What that means is that the natural gas industry is learning how to control emissions. So if they do any better than they have so far, they might even make that blue line turn down. Coal comes down, as you can see, but that's because coal production is coming down, and industrial operations that use coal are fewer in number. So although this lower line for coal looks good, it's not really. I'm most impressed by natural gas because natural gas consumption and production are rising, but the emissions are not. Here we are, components of the annual change. You can see the blue bars are very minor. That's natural gas. Petroleum is the big issue, and we need to come to grips with that one way or the other. You can see that last year, when coal production and consumption went down, so did the emissions. This is a pretty straightforward chart, but it does point a finger to petroleum. Well, folks, this is about the end of the review. In fact, it is the end of the review. One thing pardon me, that I would like to remind you is in this chart. You can see that energy expenditures consume less and less over time of the gross domestic product. So although we're using a great deal more energy as a burden on the US economy, energy is a good deal because that burden is a lot lower today than it has been. Here we are at about 5%. Up here, we were almost in 2008 at 10%, call it 9.5%, and call this one maybe 5.5%. If so, we've dropped 4 percentage points out of 9.5%. And ladies and gentlemen, that is really good performance. Pardon me, you may wonder what I'm doing in the background here. And the answer is I'm trying to avoid a sneeze. I feel like I'm about to sneeze, so I've been trying to keep myself from doing that. It's tough when you're doing videos. Anyway, that's the end of this video. I think it's taken just about 1 hour. I hope it's informed you a great deal. It should have, because these trends and forecasts that we've looked at are vital to the economy. Also, please don't forget that there is another PowerPoint file on your Moodle shell. And that PowerPoint file has long-term energy trends and forecasts prepared by the EIA just a short time ago. So although there may be some variations due to recent shifts in energy and geopolitics, I think that you will find those projections and trends to be helpful and quite interesting. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye until I see you again. Goodbye.